All right, now context is actually not really that difficult of a concept to get. It's just a lot of typing. So let's not make it any more complicated than what it needs to be. All context does is it provides data to unrelated components, right? So it's a way in which we can share data, like you can think of it like global state, okay, to all of our components, but the components don't have to be related to one another. The analogy I always use is the village granary. So the village granary has all the grain and food stuffs for the village, in times of famine or hunger. So if you live in the village, you can take from the granary. If you don't live in the village, you're not allowed in the granary. But if you are in the village, it doesn't matter if you're related or not related, it doesn't matter. You can use the granary. All right, so basically here is my ugly version of the orders. So we've got like just different food you can get. All right, and if I click add to order, I got chicken and waffles, which is $7.50. Okay, I didn't do any sort of like making this look pretty. We got avocado toast, which apparently I supposedly love. Hash wrap and cinnamon roll, cool. Now notice that like as I'm clicking buttons over here, my order is being updated on the right side with all my items and then my total. And if I remove stuff, let's see, I can remove the chicken and waffles. Okay, cool. See how the order updated and it got rid of it. Now, you may not realize, but like these are all different components. So I have a header component. I've got like a component to do like fluffy waffles, each individual item. I've also got this component over here to show me my like total. Like, but these are unrelated components. Okay, they're not like through a parent-child relationship. They're all using this thing to share data. All right, and context is again not that hard. It's just a lot of typing. All right, I've got header, menu item, menu list, and sidebar. All right, those are my four components. So I'm going to just take a quick tour of them. All right, header's easy. It just says like header sunny side up. I got to put an order count in there. Menu item. All right, this is an individual menu item. Okay, we'll just look at the HTML. It's just the name, description, calories, whether or not it's vegetarian, and then you click the button to add the item or remove the item from your order. Right? Menu list. Again, this is a container component, so all it does is just contains the menu items. But notice how there's no state here. That might appear a bit strange to you, but I'm just taking the array, the like all of my items, and then mapping them to the screen. And then there's a sidebar, and the sidebar also has like all the items in my order. Okay, so menu list displays everything that a customer could buy. Sidebar shows what is the customer's current order. All right, so we've got some weird stuff going on here because it looks like menu item is a child to menu list, but sidebar is not a parent or a child to menu list. Okay, so sidebar is not in the hierarchy with menu item and menu list. Therefore, how do I get the state? How do I make sure that state is shared between these two if they're not related to one another? I'm going to repeat that. Menu list, okay, has menu item as a child, but nowhere do you see sidebar. Okay, sidebar is its own independent component from menu list. They are not related at all. So that means I cannot pass props, for example, from one to the other because they're not related to one another. So this is where context comes in. Okay, context allows me to share data among unrelated components. So there's a number of things you have to set up in order to have a context. So I'll just kind of take you through the files. Okay, so oh yeah, so just to show you some other stuff, I made a menu.ts, which is like all the data, which shows you the menu array, and the menu array is just a array of objects for like you see they have beans and toast and avocado toast and whatever else. You get this from the lab. All right, so you don't have to type all this stuff out. That would be horrific. Okay, I also have the interface for a menu item, so you have to like model this. So I looked at the items on the lab, and they have an ID, a name, a description, calories, price, and whether or not they're vegetarian, which is Boolean. All right, you guys should be pretty good at modeling by now. If not, you need to like practice, like look at the properties they tell you, and then be able to make an interface that matches. Okay, so that's just some nuts and bolts stuff. Let's take a look at the actual context. All right, where do I want to start? All right, so contexts have providers. Where do I want to start with this? All right. A context has what's called providers. All right. So essentially, the context kind of lives off on its own little like world and has a provider which your components can use to grab data. All right. So you can think of it like global state. Typically, we've been doing state where one component owns the state. Now we're going to have where the context owns the state. All right. So you're going to have a couple pieces of setup. I normally start with the model. All right. So here, we have export interface order context model. Cool. There, an order is an array of items, right? So this property here represents like the person's order. So if we go back to like where we were, right on the right where we got avocado toast and hash wrap and cinnamon roll, that's my order, okay, which is an array of items. Okay, now what do I do? Like, what functionality do I need to give to other components to update this state? So I've got add item, which takes in an item and doesn't return anything, and remove item, which takes in an ID of which is a string and doesn't return anything, right? So typically for your context, you'll have a model, and in your model will be like, what data do I want to hold, and what functions do I want to make available to the outside world? Okay, so in order for me to fulfill requirements, I have to be able to list out what's in my order, which you can see. But also notice that like when I click on this add to order button, over here on the left is the list, right? So my sidebar is this component, but then my list is over here. But I'm clicking an add to order button where like Eggs Benedict is appearing in the sidebar, even though they're not related to one another. All right. So that functionality, like I just showed you, is here. Add item, remove item. This is the interface for them. All right. So we have a model for our context. So this is what we want to be able to do. Okay, we have the actual context. We just essentially, it's very simple. React obviously knows you're going to need to create a context. So you create context for what you want to do. I call it order context. And notice how I just basically do like const order context equals create context. Okay, create context is a built-in React function. Okay, it is the factory pattern if you really want to get into it. All right, this is a design pattern called the factory pattern. And then I just pass in, okay, my order context model with some like blank. So it's like, for example, this is like the starting value. Okay, so your context needs to have a starting value. And what I mean by that is I'm going to reset my React app and show it to you. Okay, no, I just refreshed the screen. This is my starting like state, right? There's nothing in, there's no orders, right? There's nothing in on the side in the order. So when the page first starts, there will be like nothing in the order queue. All right, so that's what line 5 does. And line 6 and 7, okay, those are just those are functions. Okay, we're just passing in functions. And now we've got our order context. So React will handle the whole like provider stuff from here. The most difficult thing about this is actually creating the context provider. This is the thing that is going to actually be provided to each component. So what do I mean by provided? Okay, so we'll see in a second. I have order context provider, which takes in a React node. Okay, as props for right now, just put this in here. All right, and you'll notice it has state. On line 10, the provider has state. Okay, so for example, in my case, I need to be able to keep track of what the person ordered. That will be the state. And now notice that I have my actual functions. This is add item, okay, which will add items to the menu and remove items. All right, and that was defined way back. You see here, I had the add item function, the remove item function back in the model. Okay, that's where I define those things. Now I actually have the implementation, what the function actually does. Cool. Then what do you do at the end? You return a context provider with the values of order, which is menu items, add item, and remove item. Okay, and then give you my provider. This looks very complicated, but basically what you're doing is saying, hey, here is essentially a function that I would like to be made available to anyone who uses this context. The next question you might be thinking is, well, Jonathan, how do you say whether or not a component can use the context. Because you just said that like it's the village granary. Some people can use it if you live in the village, but if you don't live in the village, you don't get to use it. Well, that part's pretty easy. Let's go to app.tsx. Wham. Here is the order context provider, and here are the things I want to be able to use it. Okay, so you basically will have the provider, and then you will put the components that use the context inside of it. Okay, and that's it. So these two components live in the village. Header does not live in the village. Okay, so header does not get access to this, but these guys do. The provider will be provided to each one of these components. Okay, let's see this in action. All right, so let's go to menu list. So all menu list does, so menu list, if you look up here on line 2, okay, this is coming from the menu array. So the data is coming from here. Okay, I just made a file to hold all the data. All right, and then I mapped it to menu item. Let's go to menu item. Line 7 is where we're using the context. So I am saying, okay, use context, order context, okay, which is being imported. So I am bringing in the context into this component. Okay, cool. So I brought the context, but what's in the context? The context is a thing that has an array of items, a function called add item, and a function called remove item. Okay, so I get to bring those things in, which is kind of cool. Okay, I'm using destructurings. I only want like these two functions. Okay, think of it in a menu item. We go back to our see how for like each menu item there's just two buttons, add to order and remove from order. Okay, so I don't need everything from the context. I just need those two functions because those two functions will update the state of the context. All right, so I've got those two functions, add item, remove item. I use click events to call them. So here's the cool thing. Menu item has no like direct relationship to sidebar. Okay, I'm going to repeat that. On the left, each one of these things is menu item component. So chicken and waffles is one menu item component. Eggs Benedict is another menu item component. They have nothing to do with the sidebar in terms of like hierarchy. They're not child, they're not parent, but that behind the scenes behind them is that context, that order context. So then when I click on like add to order, it will call the function. So I clicked on add to order. It calls the function add item. Well, Jonathan, where is add item at? Add item is all the way over back in our provider. This is the function that actually gets called. Okay, and the state of what's in my order is kept inside the context provider. That the provider is the thing that basically gets passed around to each component. All right, so essentially the provider is given to the component, and you can take from the context what you need and then use it. All right, so menu items able to add and remove items, which is dope. And then if we go to the sidebar, okay, notice how we also can use context here on line 5. This time I'm just using the order because the sidebar's job is just to display like, hey, like, what did the person order? Where did this come from? Go back to your provider. Okay, so order is here. It's my menu items. Okay, the menu items I have. All right, so I take all the menu items I have in my order, and then I just map them to the screen, and I give a total, which I just use reduce. Okay, so I just reduce, order.reduce, previous item, so like the previous thing in the item, and then you just basically like add them. It's a sum function. You just add them as you loop through, okay, and then that'll give you the total. Now I didn't add any sort of code for like making nice pretty like dollar signs with making sure it had 2 decimals afterward. I just like show the data to the screen. Obviously you can make it look a lot more pretty. All right, but here is kind of the mind bending thing. All right, this order context provider. Okay, this is the thing that is being passed around to all the components in the village. This is the granary. Okay, it has a state. It has functions, and then anyone in the village, and again, you have to remember this part will be easily missed. In your app.tsx, you have to wrap the components that are in the village inside your context provider. If you don't do this, all you're going to get is that default value. It will not function. Okay, so menu list and sidebar, they're in the village. They get to use the context. They get to grab everything out of the context. So they get to use add item, they get to use remove item, they get to use order. All right, that's what they get to use because they are in the village. Okay, so the context is kind of invisible. Okay, but this is great for like trying to avoid prop drilling, right? So if we have like 3 components and then like you'd have to pass data from the parent to the child to the grandchild, but the child doesn't really want the data. Well, we can use the context, and the context can take components that have absolutely no direct familiar relationship and share data and functionality between them. This is a very common thing to share state, but we don't have to share state. It could be a value, it could be whatever the heck we want. Okay, inside the provider is our like domain, okay, as to what we would like to do. Um, as far as how it's set up, again, you have the context provider. It is a function, okay, that takes in children as a props. Okay, just use that for right now. We'll get into that what that means later, but like just use that for the moment. And then you've got a state, okay, for menu items, and then you've got 2 functions to add and remove items, and then we return a provider with these values. This provider is for anyone in the village. That means that menu item and sidebar both get it. And then yeah, so menu list and by extension, menu items. So I did want to mention one thing. Menu item is a child of menu list. That means that menu item will also get the provider. Okay, so children of components that are in the provider are also get the provider. All right, so we'll talk later about when you might not want to use a context provider, like a context, because like sometimes you don't want like all the components to share state. Okay, but this is a pretty common thing. All right. Again, the 3 files on the left are the ones I would review. Okay, order the context model, and the provider. And that's what you have to build in order to get the data to be shared between the different components. Once you have that, the rest is pretty easy.